Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session of today's schedule on Kidney Action Week. We are so excited that we've had two great sessions earlier today. This week, we have several sessions, so please don't forget to check the agenda for the entire week schedule of sessions. It's been a great day so far, and I hope you've had a great day learning about kidney disease and connecting with people all across the country. My name is Melanie Paris, and I'm Senior Director of Health Initiatives and Education here at American Kidney Fund, and I am so pleased and honored to be serving as moderator for today's session on clinical trials and the importance of a diverse pool of patient participants. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of joining Dr. Kirk Campbell and Patrick Gee, who will provide their insights on this very important topic. But before we weigh in, I would like to take a minute to thank our session sponsors, AstraZeneca and GSK. We greatly appreciate their support and partnership of AKF's efforts to educate the public about clinical trials, as well as helping to increase diverse patient participation in clinical trials. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists for today. Dr. Kirk Campbell is a professor of medicine and vice chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the director of the nephrology fellowship program at Sinai Medical Center in New York City. In addition to treating patients with kidney disease, Dr. Campbell leads an NIH-funded research program, actively participates in clinical trials, and is an elected member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation. Patrick Gee has spent years as an advocate fighting against systemic issues such as poverty, social racial injustices, criminal justice reform, and education reform. Patrick graduated from the American University School of Public Affairs in 2012 with a PhD in justice law and criminology. In 2013, in April, he was diagnosed with stage 3B kidney disease. He began peritoneal dialysis in December of that year as well, and 3.5 years later, Patrick received a kidney transplant. Through his own journey with kidney disease, Patrick has participated in various clinical trials and will be able to provide firsthand experiences and advice for anyone who's considering joining a clinical trial. Throughout our conversation today, we will be answering your questions about clinical trial experiences from the perspective of Patrick Gee as a person living with kidney disease, and Dr. Campbell is a researcher who designs and oversees clinical trials. So feel free to type in your questions and comments into the chat window on the Kidney Action Week event site or in the comments section if you are joining us on social media. As we go through our sessions today, we will try to answer as many questions as possible. But before we get started with audience questions, I'll give a brief overview of clinical trial experience, and then Dr. Campbell will go more in depth into diversity in clinical trials and the importance of that. Okay. So just to give you a very quick overview about clinical trials, for some of you who may not be familiar with the whole process and how it works. So clinical trials are research studies that test new treatments, or even devices before they are approved for people to use. The Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA, is the US government agency that decides if new treatments or medical devices are effective and safe for people to use. Before the FDA can approve a new treatment for use in people, clinical trial results must show the treatment works and causes no harm to people. You can join a clinical trial as a healthy volunteer or as a patient volunteer, as someone who is struggling with a particular disease that's being studied. Sometimes clinical trials will directly benefit a participant because of access to new treatments that aren't available to the public yet. And the reason we're talking about it today in the context, of course, of kidney disease and what we do at American Kidney Fund is that there has been an historic underrepresentation of minority participants in clinical trials for various reasons. But right now, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Campbell. You can expand more with the information that you've provided about clinical trials and the importance of a diverse population.
Thanks so much, Melanie, and thanks again to the American Kidney Fund for inviting me, and happy to talk about diversity in clinical trials. So Melanie gave a nice overview of what clinical trials are and why clinical research is important. I'll be talking a little bit about the nephrologist perspective and why diversity is important in conducting clinical trials. Next slide, please. So, one thing we should perhaps tackle in the beginning is the concerning history of kidney disease being underrepresented in clinical trials in general. The slide on the left shows an image from a manuscript by my colleague, Dr. Steve Koka, showing that cardiovascular trials tend to not include patients with kidney disease. And a similar thing happened on the right, where we're showing the Pfizer mRNA vaccine study that actually had less than 1% of patients enrolled had kidney disease. So, when this happens as a starting point, we do end up having some concerns about properly advising our patients with kidney disease around cardiovascular morbidity, mortality, and also more recently and certainly more pertinent to the current landscape, the benefits associated with COVID vaccination. Next slide, please. So the clinical trial process is long, it's tedious, it's expensive, and this is certainly applicable to the pre-pandemic phase and not the one where the entire world was mobilized to develop a vaccine for the purpose of shortening a pandemic. But normally you're looking at 5 to 15 years for the entire clinical trial process from beginning to end to progress. And it normally starts off in what we call the preclinical phase, where testing is done commonly on models of disease, not on patients. So cell-based models, animal models, and it's really meant to explore how a drug could work or a device from a mechanistic standpoint. Only then, once safety concerns have been addressed in the preclinical phase, do you move on to human testing. And that normally starts off in a phase 1 where, again, the focus is on safety, not whether or not the drug or device works, but whether it's safe for human testing in later studies. Then there's a phase 2 component, which explores the effectiveness in a smaller number of patients before moving on to a phase 3, which is more pivotal with a larger number of patients enrolled and normally compared to standard of care currently available treatments where available, because there are many disorders, certainly in the kidney space, for which there are no FDA-approved treatment options. And only then, after phase 2 and 3 studies are completed, would an FDA review happen after submission for approval. But once a drug is approved, the trial process doesn't completely end, right? Every time a new drug comes to the market, there's a recognition that the clinical trial setting is different from the real world, right? The clinical trial process, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it's very controlled. You have very strict inclusion-exclusion criteria. You want healthy patients with the disease indication to be enrolled, right? And so after approval, there's a phase 4 where in the real world, over time, you get to assess the efficacy and safety of the drug in that real world setting that's not as tightly controlled as the clinical trial. Next slide. So unfortunately, there's been a significant underrepresentation of patients from diverse backgrounds in clinical trials. On the left, you can see that the US population being approximately 12% African American, 16% Hispanic. But on the right, when you look at the clinical trial population, it's really only about 5% African American and 1% Hispanic. And this has a lot of implications, again, for whether or not we're really getting representative information about how drugs and devices would work in the study populations represented in the trial. Next slide. So there have been a number of barriers to minority participation in clinical trials, and some include mistrust, the lack of comfort with the clinical trial process. There's been a lack of information about trials, right? There are many patients who are never told about trial opportunities. There's time and resource constraint that's come up as a barrier to trial participation, where a lot of studies may require a patient to take time off from work or school to go to a study site, whereas a regular medical visit can be much shorter sometimes. And again, a general lack of awareness. Next slide. So, we've seen this certainly firsthand in nephrology. This is a summary slide of some of the recent, very high impact, quite successful clinical trials in nephrology. And you can see the red bar for patients of African ancestry enrolled has been very low. Really, most of the studies is really less than 10%, less than 5% in many cases. The lupus nephritis study had about 14% Black patients. But again, when you're considering disorders that predominantly affect, again, Black and brown patients, it's important to have representative trial enrollment so that you can confidently make the right conclusions about how safe and effective these drugs are. Next slide, please. And, this is important because we know that, taking one example, IgA nephropathy, this is a disorder for which there's no specific approved treatment in the US. But looking at data from Asia, there's quite good efficacy for removing tonsils or giving hydroxychloroquine. The problem is we don't have similar data, right, in the US population with a more diverse cohort of patients. So there is, hesitancy about recommending these treatment approaches to diverse populations, for example, in the US, whereas there's more comfort in some Asian countries. Next slide. And one striking example of how important it is to recruit patients from diverse backgrounds is this larger study on lupus nephritis, the ALM study, one of the most important studies on lupus nephritis, comparing mycophenolate to cyclophosphamide. And overall, the drugs were equally efficacious. There wasn't much of a difference in terms of efficacy when patients got MMF versus cyclophosphamide. However, looking at a subgroup analysis, Black and Latino patients did better with MMF, and it was great that the study was sufficiently powered to make that conclusion about Black and Latino patients who, since then, have preferentially in most centers been prescribed MMF. So this is where, again, it's important that the study cohort represent real-world practice. So I think with that, I will pause and turn it back over to Melanie.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, for that really great overview. It provided some very important perspective for us in the conversation that we're going to have. So just following up with you on that, tell us about your work in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion as you pursue work in clinical trials.
Right. So I wear a few hats here at Sinai, and of course, patient care and medical education are at the forefront. And in the clinical trial realm, I have a specific interest in disorders associated with proteinuria. So protein spilling disorders, I mentioned IgA nephropathy, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, membranous nephropathy, and so on. And many of these disorders, again, are disproportionately affecting patients of color who often don't have approved medical therapy, right, for these disorders. And several of them, FSGS, IgA nephropathy, for example, high risk of progression towards requiring dialysis or needing a kidney transplant. And so, fortunately, there's been a big increase in the number of clinical trials, phase 2 and 3 trials, with a number of promising new drugs on the horizon. And so this has offered hope, right? This has been one path where patients can have the benefit of getting treatment that's specifically developed for their biopsy-proven kidney disease, right? That they would otherwise not have access to. And so clinical trials and clinical trial participation has sort of become a way of clinically managing patients successfully. And so, we want to certainly bring as much access to patients and patients of color with the new drugs on the horizon.
Very important. Thank you so much for that. So Patrick, let me turn to you about, your perspective. You have advocated toward equitable healthcare for many years, as I mentioned in your introduction. So in your opinion, and from your perspective, especially as someone living with kidney disease, how does diversity in clinical trials work toward that overarching goal of health equity?
Well, there are a number of things that come to mind when it talks about ensuring equitable healthcare access. One is improving clinical trial diversity and inclusivity, which is really critical to improving health equity. It helps ensure that we have medicines and treatments that are suitable for the intended population. Second, participants in clinical trials should represent the people that will use the medical product. And this is oftentimes not the case when it comes to medical research. And lastly, it helps to improve the effectiveness of medicines and vaccines that will be accessed throughout the world's population.
Thank you so much. So, looking additionally at clinical trials and the slides that you had presented, Dr. Campbell, you mentioned 5 critical barriers to diverse participation in clinical trials. Can you elaborate on what medical professionals can do to help increase participation among a diverse group of individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, I think unfortunately a legacy, right, within this country, right, of leading to mistrust in the medical community among communities of color, right, and so tackling some of the concerns about being involved in a trial head on would be important, right, and I think medical professionals should be very open and candid about addressing patient fears. Some comments that I've heard in practice are patients being concerned about being treated like guinea pigs, right? Or important treatment being withheld while they're enrolled in a trial. And I think, the ethical framework and the regulatory framework that's been developed over the last several decades, I think it's quite robust. And I think patients would be reassured to know that the care that they get in the context of a trial can be superior to what they get outside. I always say it's bordering on concierge medicine, right? Where you have around the clock access to a study team, and you need to know about every single symptom that you develop, whether it could be related to the study drug or not. We need to know, right? And we're there to help facilitate and answer any questions that folks have along the way. But I think patients also need to be empowered to know that they can choose where they get their care. And I know that there are sometimes insurance and other constraints that can limit this. But patients do have the option of going to sites and looking up trial opportunities outside of their regular practice if their regular providers are not offering clinical trial access. And I think that's quite important that folks need to be aware of as well.
Thank you for that. So Patrick, let me turn to you about your experience. So you've talked in the past about participation in clinical trials. So can you tell us what you learned about them and why did you choose to participate?
Some of the things that I learned about participating in clinical trials was that I had access to high quality medical professionals as part of the disease treatment. It was the possibility of accessing new drugs that may not yet be available. It increased my knowledge of disease and supports for drug development. Some of the places that I've learned about clinical trials were places such as clinicaltrials.gov. Also, in my efforts working with the National Institute of Health and their clinical research studies. Also, there's a website called researchmatch.org, which is an NIH-funded initiative that allows persons with particular ailments and diseases to be able to look up a particular clinical trial that may match whatever they are afflicted with. Also, I've learned about clinical trials from patient advocacy groups, as well as my physicians and care providers.
So I have a follow-up question, Patrick, for you, because we are getting audience questions right now. And I think this is, pretty relevant to what you just answered. But one question we have from Luis is, were you scared to participate? He says, I'm always afraid medications are just going to end up making my kidneys worse.
Yeah, there's always a certain level of fear when you go into the unknown. So you should never discount that. And that's why it's always a good practice to do your research on the research that you want to participate in. Make sure that it matches or fits your particular needs. Make sure that you talk to the clinical trialist team and ask as many questions as possible. If you feel that you may need support, there's nothing wrong with inviting your caregiver, care partner, or a support person to be there with you that may also ask contributing questions to help you decide. And lastly, you have the opportunity to opt out of a clinical trial at any given time if you don't feel that it's meeting your needs, if you don't feel that the team is properly cooperating with you, communicating with you, or if you just have this eerie feeling that something is not right. It is your choice, and you have the right to opt out at any given time.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that point, Patrick, about being able to bring support people with you, people in your life who can help you go through the process, help you manage different questions or give you feedback. Did you hear what I heard? I think that's also very important. So thank you for sharing that. So Dr. Campbell, from your perspective as someone who runs clinical trials, can you talk to us about the recruitment process? So can you talk about, from your perspective, how do you start the recruitment process? What does that look like?
Yeah, thanks so much. The recruitment process starts in many ways. Sometimes it's patient initiated, and that actually is when it is interesting and very enlightening, right? When patients have done their homework and they can approach a study site for more information about a study that they may be eligible for. And whether they contact us first or we approach the patients, the initial conversation is really just that, an introduction, right? Just to gauge interest and to see if we can arrange, if mutually agreeable and the eligibility seems appropriate, we would arrange a screening visit, right? Where that's a formal process of consenting for the study, reading through the consent form, being aware of all the rights associated and risks of taking the study medication, Again, if the consenting process, after all the questions are answered that the patient would have, then we'd proceed to the screening. And we like to do those on the same day, really out of respect for patient time. Sometimes the consenting visit can be separate from the screening, but I think if it is done on the same day, it is an efficient use of time. Typically, screening labs are sent off to a central lab, so not at the site where the labs are obtained. So there is a bit of a wait where communication continues and follow-up questions can be answered from a virtual or remote setting. And if the patient qualifies for the study, then there's normally an initial study visit set up after screening where, for example, the first dose of a medication would be administered. Protocols do vary. Sometimes there can be a month or two in between screening and formal initiation, administration of a study drug. As Patrick mentioned, patients can drop out of the study at any point from consenting, screening at any point. If something doesn't seem right, or if you're not happy with the way things are going, patients do have the right of discontinuing. So that's usually how the process begins.
So I'm glad you brought that up because Patrick, you mentioned it too, and it goes to a question that we have received from an audience member. It says, don't you have to sign a contract that makes you have to keep going through with participating? And you both mentioned you can stop at any point. So I just want you to just talk about that a little bit more. Do you have to sign something when you begin a clinical trial? And what are you signing most of the time? What are you exactly agreeing to? And you can opt out at any time. I just want to reiterate that point.
Right. I know in my experience, there's always an agreement. But the first thing you should do is to know your rights, because patients do have rights. And to make sure, again, if you're not familiar with legal jargon, then make sure you have somebody with you that can help you to understand this. You can remove your consent at any given time, and most clinical trials are set up that way. Even if you are in, if you've been in the trials for a while, you can certainly say, hey, I want to get out of it. I'm not comfortable with what's going on. Also, during that particular process, you should discuss the purpose of your participation in the trials. You want to make sure that you have open communication between yourself and the clinical trialist, and allow time for questions about the clinical trial, and ask about any potential risks, possible side effects, and discomforts. But the main thing is, before you sign anything, to ask as many questions as possible. There's no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to your life and your health. So I would just encourage the person to ask that question, and everybody else that's watching this, ask as many questions as possible. You don't have to consent that very day. It may take you a month. Just make sure that you ask every question you so desire, so you can feel comfortable accepting and participating.
Thank you for that. And reiterate too, you can ask questions at any time. You don't have to ask all your questions up front. If you forget to ask something and you're already participating, you can still ask questions at any point during your participation. So we have a question from the audience, I think can go to both of you, but I'll start with you, Dr. Campbell. Aren't clinical trials used by people who don't have more options for treatment and help?
That's a good question. Typically it depends on the clinical indication and the reason that the trial is being conducted. I mentioned some of the rare kidney disorders for which there's no approved treatment. And yes, in some cases, the trial is an option for getting treatment where it may not otherwise exist. In other cases, the purpose is to see if the treatment that's available in the clinical setting by prescription, if it can be improved, right, by novel agents. So I think there are different purposes to clinical trials, but it really depends on the indication. Should also, mention that there is typically compensation for trial participation that's nominal, usually to cover the inconvenience and cost of travel. And of course, the study drug is normally provided by the sponsor, so is not related to insurance or dependent on the ability of the patient to pay for the drug.
Thank you for that. And I also want to encourage our audience to take a look at American Kidney Fund's web information that we have about clinical trial participation. I mean, we won't get to maybe all of your questions, or you may think of some questions later. And we have great resources that you can refer to when you're thinking about clinical trials or any questions you have. So Patrick, for you, I want to ask you, when you were participating in clinical trials, can you talk about the type of support that you received from doctors, medical professionals, the clinical staff who are running the trials?
Yeah, it's really been great. It's a great educational process because it allows open dialogue. Again, as I said previously, before I sign anything, I want to make sure that I'm aware of my rights as a patient, as a human being, of participating in the clinical trial. I also want to ask as many questions as I can. I want to learn not only about the clinical trial itself and the purpose of the trial, but I also want to know about the trial team, how long they have been working in this particular area, what kind of breakthroughs are they looking for. Also, it's kind of exciting to be a part of any new innovations, especially if you have a family history. You may not be suffering with it at that particular time, but if you have a family history, you want to make sure that you can better take care of yourself. That's another reason why to participate in a clinical trial. So the support that I had and still have is really good. They update me every step of the way. They send me letters letting me know results so far and information on the next steps. So it's been a really positive outcome with my participation in clinical trials.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to get to some of the audience questions that have been coming in as we've had this conversation. So one, it's a very general question, but one that gets asked a lot. If it's experimental, how do you even know it's safe? Is it actually safe? Dr. Campbell?
Right. So it is a good question. And as I mentioned in one of the overview slides, the clinical trials are at different phases. So if you're enrolled in a phase 3 trial, you'll know that by definition, the earlier phases have been conducted, which would include the safety and the smaller safety/efficacy portion. So it is more advanced. If the drug has never before been given to a human being and you're the very first one who's gotten it, then obviously the safety question would still be there, right? So you will know that the study sponsor will be very vigilant about monitoring the first in human subject, right? That patient, and would and should be transparent that this is the first time it's being administered. So as Patrick mentioned, asking about how many individuals have gotten this drug before you is a reasonable question, right? Where are we with its development? If it's later on, then at least you'll know that there is a safety record. And you can ask, what are the main side effects that you could expect based on prior patient experiences? Those are all reasonable questions to ask.
I'm glad you brought that up because that does lead into a couple of other questions. So one question comes from Lily. If a person has side effects, do the people running the trial provide help? And also, just following up on medications, do you keep getting medications after the trial is over, or does the treatment end when the participation is over? I think those are great questions.
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. And, to tackle the first ones about side effects, absolutely. There are minor, major, serious adverse events. There's a spectrum, right, of side effects that patients can have. Anything from a mild symptom that's transient, goes away in an hour or two, to something requiring hospitalization or worse, right? And absolutely, the study team is 100% engaged, and it's the responsibility of the study team to help and assist the patient, right? Patients are encouraged to continue to follow up with their primary and some specialty physicians that they were seeing outside of the study. But for any new symptoms or worsening of pre-existing symptoms that happen during the conduct of the study team absolutely is involved and engaged. That is their responsibility. And following up, about the end of the study and whether the treatment ends, it depends on the study design. There are some studies that switch to an open label. So there are many trials where, you're getting a drug versus placebo, for example, but some are open label. You're getting the active drug. Either way, many studies transition to an open label phase where the drug is administered over years, sometimes up until it gets ultimately approved, because another question comes up, like how long should patients take the drug? What is the long-term safety signal? And so those are other study questions that can be on top of the existing phase 20. So it really depends on the study design. There are some disorders and trials where it's a short-term question only, with the plan to do a later stage study that patients who are in the earlier phase may be eligible for further participation. So asking about that question, especially for diseases that aren't cured by a short-term drug administration, is a very valid question, and one that could impact whether or not patients choose to participate in the study. Very good questions.
So I do want to bring up something that has come up very frequently regarding diversity in clinical trials, especially now as we've seen the vaccine for COVID-19 roll out, and it's a lot in the news. I want to transition to talking about the Tuskegee experiment. Many of you may know that it was an experiment that went on for many years in Tuskegee, Alabama, where African-American men were denied treatment for syphilis just to see what would happen. And that has caused a lot of reluctance among African Americans and maybe others for participating in clinical trials. So, Patrick, what are your thoughts on that? What kind of impact have you seen that happen or have in your circles and discussions that you've had as an advocate? How do you respond to that?
It has caused a lot of COVID vaccine hesitancy, a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of misinformation going out to all communities because people are not sure. And when they look at Tuskegee, I think they get it confused. Tuskegee did not implement a vaccine. It promised, but it did not. So it failed to treat the folks that were actually given syphilis. Here, there's been a number of campaigns going on when it comes to COVID, but one of the things was that a lot of the clinical trials did not include people who are at risk or people that had immunocompromised immune system. So that's where it's unfortunate. And some of the things that we don't talk about, there are some kidney patients or folks that are at risk that may not be able to take the vaccine. No different than those that can't take, a flu shot. Is either their systems can't handle it or the side effects are just, too much to bear. So when you look at the history of racial injustice in this country when it comes to medical atrocities, um, it's not unusual for people in minoritized communities to bring up these certain things that have happened in past history. But just like one of the things that I really appreciate Dr. Campbell talking about was the medical oversight is really different now. We have different policies and procedures in place to kind of safeguard against these particular things. So now you have more people in the kidney community that really wants to participate in these particular clinical trials. I know for myself, I participate in the COVID antibody trial, and it's been going great learning about the antibodies, the efficacy of the vaccine. So, you're going to have naysayers, you're going to have resistance, but I encourage people to just follow organizations that are really sharing real-time information, and not so much getting stuff off of social media, off the news, or from somebody's uncle or cousin or something like that. Make sure that you are following medical professionals and organizations that align themselves with the World Health Organization or even the CDC to stay abreast of this.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because there's so much information out now, and everybody is getting things from all different sources. So your point about making sure that it's reliable sources that you're getting is very critical. Dr. Campbell, what are your thoughts on that too?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with the sentiment that Patrick mentioned. And also, again, to reiterate just some of the regulatory and ethical oversight structures that are now in place that perhaps weren't as robust, decades ago, when, many unfortunate practices occurred. And the medical establishment has learned over time. And we still have a way to go, right? I mean, I think the truth is we still need more diversity among decision makers and clinical trial leaders and among the medical and scientific workforce. I think we need to spend more time understanding the concerns of patients and prioritizing their needs in a patient-centered manner, right? It's become a buzzword, patient-centered care, but bringing that to the clinical trial landscape is crucial, meaning involving more patients and patient advocacy groups in clinical trial design to tackle some of the barriers and constraints that may limit participation. So I think, there's been a lot of progress, but still a lot more work to be done.
So we had a couple of questions come in from our audience related to the COVID vaccine. Said the COVID vaccine went through really, really fast. How do we know that they're safe for people with kidney disease? And kind of related to that as well, were kidney disease patients included in the clinical trials for COVID vaccine? If not, why not?
Yeah, so again, excellent questions. As I showed earlier, some of the initial trials actually had very low participation of patients with kidney disease in the initial studies, right? However, we know from that, real world experience after the emergency use authorizations were given to certainly the 3 vaccines in the US, a lot of patients with chronic kidney disease, patients on dialysis, patients with kidney transplants got vaccinated. And we've gotten that information. We published some of that data at our site, and we've seen a lot of data from Israel and all over the world showing that patients with kidney disease do respond, right? I mean, I think for dialysis patients, some transplant patients, the antibody response may be lower, but there's still significant protection, and the safety signal was quite encouraging. So there wasn't a big safety concern. The question about how fast the vaccines were developed also is an important one. And I remember having a conference with my family about this and really explaining the same slide I showed about the three different phases for clinical trials. They were all done. It's just that they were being done at the same time because of the pandemic. So it wasn't a matter of cutting corners. It literally was the entire world's biomedical research infrastructure mobilized towards this one goal. There were research labs shut down all over the world except for ones working on COVID vaccines and COVID projects. So this is what can happen when you have tremendous resources applied, personal resources and financial resources dedicated to this. And the technology had been there, it just hadn't been used for this purpose. So we're pretty confident that due diligence was done, but it's just that it was an extraordinary amount of effort that led to such rapid approval and development.
And thank you for addressing that. I know that's come up quite often about the speed of development and how long it normally takes. So I'm glad you covered that. Excuse me, I want to transition a little bit because we have a couple of questions related to clinical trials related to children. Larry asks, my son is on dialysis and his doctor asked if we wanted him to participate in a clinical trial. Are they safe for children? That's a big concern my wife and I have. And the other one was just generally, is it safe for children?
That's a great question. I think there, of course, we generally do clinical trials in the adult population first to make sure, these drugs are safe before we give them to children. You see this with the COVID vaccines, for example, with the age limit steadily going down incrementally to really prioritize safety. However, on the flip side, as we're seeing with the Delta variant now and with many disorders, children are susceptible, right, to illness. So that's the double-edged sword where we definitely want to have availability and accessibility for children in clinical trials for the same reason that we want adults to be in trials to benefit, right, from potentially life-saving, life-improving therapy. So again, it really depends on what's being tested, the vigilance, weighing the risks and benefits. It's always a personal decision, with the primary physicians, with the study team, asking all the questions, because there's never going to be a right blanket answer for everyone, right? It is going to be an individual decision whether or not to be engaged in a trial. But again, the same regulatory oversight perhaps is even stronger, right? For children who are not able to consent and they rely on adults to consent on their behalf. So I think doing due diligence and weighing the risks and benefits is always key.
Thank you for that. So Patrick, one of the questions that sometimes we even get at Kidney Fund about clinical trials, how much time does it take? Can you talk about the time commitment that you had when you participated in a clinical trial overall?
It just depends on the trial itself. One of the things that before you join a clinical trial, you can find out how long the trial lasts. Sometimes I remember being in one that lasted a year, one that lasted maybe a couple of months. They just vary depending on the intricate details of that particular trial. So the trial time can really vary from trial to trial. It just depends. But normally during the orientation process for the clinical trial, they would normally tell you up front how long the trial will last.
Thank you for that, because we get a lot of questions, what is it really like? And how long does it take? And when can you expect to get answers? Here's a really good question that I'd like both of you to address. So James asks, do the trial doctors work with my doctor? I just think that's a very good question that's come up a few times on both sides. So Dr. Campbell, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll start. And there's some work that we've done with the NephCure Foundation around this very topic to develop a contract for the referring providers who are very familiar with the patients and have a long established relationship, how they interface and interact with the clinical trial team and the study physicians, because there should be communication, right? And you want to, again, encourage patients not to break off contact with their regular doctors when they enroll in a trial, right? You still need that perspective and input, right, on your management, right? So I think that is crucially important, and the communication should be bidirectional. The primary team should be updating the study team if the patient status changes, and the study team should update the referring and primary providers on the study progress. That should happen. And in reference to an earlier question, what happens when the study ends? The management should continue, right, with the referring and primary team as well. So you need that communication before, during, and after.
So Patrick, how did you make sure that your doctors that you already had were in communication with the team that was running the clinical trial that you were participating in? Did you have to do something on your end as a patient to make sure that that communication was aligned?
Before I participated in a clinical trial, I ran it by my care team. And I also, during the trial orientation, I asked if my care provider could get updates on the results, which actually worked out to be fine. So if I would go in for an appointment, my care provider and I could actually sit down and have a discussion on my progress in the clinical trials. So it was really a great thing to have two different care teams working on the same issue. And just like Dr. Campbell said, once the trial ends, once the trial ended, my care providers continue with the management and the oversight. So yeah, it was really good for me.
I'm glad to hear that. And you offered really good tips as a patient, writing things down, having your questions ready, being very active in participating in your care with your care team. And I think that that's really great points to make for the audience. Another question too is, do I need to live by the National Institutes of Health, which is in the Washington, D.C. area, to participate in a clinical trial? And that's from Mary Lou.
Answer is no. The NIH certainly has a lot of very important and exciting trials ongoing, but there are clinical trial sites all around the country and all around the world. So typically, the study recruitment site will have a number of options for recruitment, hopefully in a location that's nearby. Oftentimes, they'll even sponsor travel to a location that's not close to where the patients live. So there can be options, and again, it's important to contact the study site to discuss some of those opportunities and options.
And Patrick, when you participated in clinical trial, where was it? Was it close to where you lived? Did you have to travel somewhere for the treatment?
Actually, it was one clinical trial was out of the country, and I didn't have to travel. And other clinical trials have been all over the country. And again, I didn't have to travel. A lot of times they would, those that were in cooperation with my care team, they would just send any testing things either to my home or to my provider, and I would just go there and do what I needed to do, and they would send off the results. So just like Dr. Campbell said, no, you don't have to live near NIH or any of the test sites. They will make it accessible for you.
And do you have to pay anything for this to participate? Do you have to have insurance, or is it open to anyone?
Everything that I've done has been open. They take care of everything, even when it comes to shipping. You know, you don't have to pay for anything. And just like Dr. Campbell said again, you know, there are a number of trials where you get compensated for participating. So they tend to take care of everything.
Well, I really wish we had more time because we have other questions and I wish we could get to all of them. So as we close, what final thoughts do each of you have about participation in clinical trials? If there are just 1 to 2 things that you'd like to leave with our audience as they think about participating in clinical trials and what you'd want them to know, what would they be? Patrick, I'll start with you.
For me, you know, it's an opportunity to learn about the intricacies of clinical trials and how important they are to promoting a better quality of life and care. And also, because, you know, I'm a part of the underrepresented community, it's always good to be there so people from other underrepresented communities can have an ally. You know, if people see me participating and they know how important advocacy is, they can call on me, ask me questions or whatever, and I can actually be with them through that particular process.
And Dr. Campbell.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Patrick. I would only add that, you know, again, for certain diagnoses, the clinical trial represents the best treatment opportunity. You know, in fact, we're updating a lot of our practice guidelines, and for some diagnoses in nephrology, clinical trial participation is recommended. You know, above traditional approaches that nephrologists have used in the last several decades. So it is important to ask questions about trial opportunities, but, you know, again, weighing the risks and benefits of the particular study protocol, seeing if it's best for you, and getting input from your trusted physician, as well as other options, right, from the study team.
That's just a great way to close out the session. This has been great information. Again, I'd like to encourage our audience, please check out the American Kidney Fund web pages on clinical trials. We have guides that you can download to take with you to your doctor to ask questions about clinical trials, a lot of information about them. I really appreciate you, Dr. Campbell and Patrick, for joining us and providing this really valuable information about clinical trials now. I haven't heard many people talk about clinical trials as often as I've heard in the last year and a half, so the conversation is definitely timely. I would also like to give a big thanks, generous thanks to our sponsors for this session, GSK and AstraZeneca, for making this possible and for us to provide this very valuable information to our audience. You all are great partners for us, and we are very appreciative of your support for our programming. I would also like to direct you to the end of the slides, where we have, again, resources that you can use, that you can send to your family about all of the information around clinical trials. We also have a survey that we would like for you to take, a very short one, so that we know how well we're doing, what other kind of suggestions that you have for us, so that we can make sure that we provide the best programming possible for everyone in our audience. Thank you very much, and don't forget to join us tomorrow for great sessions that we have in store. Check the agenda, share it with your family, friends, patients, providers. We're really excited about being able to provide all of this information to you about kidney disease and the various conditions associated with kidney disease. So look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.